the country whose title I've been so greatly privileged to bear during so much of my life and duty.
King Charles had expected a private conversation with his eldest son. What he did not expect was for William to walk into the room carrying a sealed letter that should never have disappeared. The moment the prince placed it before him and quietly explained where it had been found, Charles stopped speaking. Because the handwriting on that envelope belonged to someone whose words still carried enormous power inside the Windsor family. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William had asked for the room to be cleared before entering. No advisors, no secretaries, no household staff. That request unsettled King Charles. Private royal correspondence, personal letters handled outside ordinary public records, was protected by discretion. Yet his son was not there to discuss paperwork. The future king placed the original handwritten letter before his father and told him what he had discovered. Camilla had removed it from a confidential correspondence file and arranged for it to remain hidden rather than reach Charles. Charles stared at the envelope before touching it. He knew the handwriting. Diana's hand carried memories he had spent decades learning to live beside, now sitting before him in words he had never read. William watched carefully. Angry, he refused to turn it into revenge. He told the king that Charles deserved the truth, and that no one had the right to decide which parts of Diana's voice reached him or her sons. William then explained where the letter had been found. It had not been resting inside an obvious archive box. Someone had enclosed it within an unrelated file recently marked for removal from active Windsor storage, meaning records still used or reviewed by the household. The placement disturbed Charles. It suggested the letter had not simply been forgotten. Someone had made sure it stayed invisible. Charles unfolded the pages. The first lines were not bitter. Diana wrote with startling calm about William, Harry, the future of the family, and the emotional damage she feared could grow if old wounds shaped decisions after she was gone. That gentleness struck harder than accusation. The king slowed. His hand stopped halfway down the final page. William said nothing. Charles finished the last sentence, lowered the letter onto the table, and remained silent. Then he looked directly at his son. "Who knew this was here?" William answered quietly. Charles turned toward the closed door. Camilla was about to be summoned, and the buried letter was no longer merely about the past. It had become a test of trust between a husband, a wife, and a son. For Charles, the letter reopened a chapter he had spent decades learning to live beside. For William, it reached somewhere far more personal, the memory of a mother whose absence had shaped almost every major choice of his adult life. And for Camilla, the discovery threatened something she had spent years trying to secure, not simply her place beside the king, but trust inside a family that had never completely forgotten how painfully their story began. Charles read the same sentence again, then once more. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a conversation that had never happened. Diana had written about her sons with the kind of concern only a mother could put into private words. William watched his father struggle with the realization that this was not historical memorabilia. It was a message that had been intended to reach him. The king finally admitted, quietly, that he had never seen it before. William felt anger rise, but he kept his voice steady. He told Charles that the letter mattered because it belonged to their family history, not because he wanted Diana's memory to dominate the present. The prince had lived long enough with loss to understand that the past could not be changed. But hiding his mother's words was different. Someone had decided what her sons were allowed to know, and that crossed a line he could not ignore. Camilla sensed the danger before anyone explained it. Elsewhere inside Windsor, she asked an aide whether Charles had requested her presence. The queen consort, the title used for the wife of a reigning king, tried to keep her tone controlled, but when the aide confirmed that William was still with him, her composure shifted. She asked how long the meeting had been going on. Then she asked whether the king had said why he wanted her there. William had one more piece of evidence. He handed Charles an old routing slip, a record showing how sensitive correspondence moved between trusted offices. The paper showed that Diana's letter had entered a restricted process before suddenly disappearing from the official chain. The king studied the notation and froze. One phrase beside the entry was familiar to him. It matched wording once used inside his own household. Charles looked back at the letter. That detail changed everything. Camilla approached the room moments later. knowing something serious waited behind the door. Charles did not rise when she entered. William remained where he was, silent but firm, while the letter rested between father and son. The king looked at William. "Do not leave." Camilla heard him. And to understand why Charles needed his son there, the story had to return to the night that letter first became dangerous enough for someone to make it disappear. Every buried secret has a moment when concealment becomes a decision. In this case, that moment came during a private correspondence review years earlier, when a forgotten envelope resurfaced among personal papers linked to Charles and Diana. What happened during that review would later look less like routine housekeeping and more like the point of no return, a single conversation that turned an old letter into something somebody believed had to disappear. Camilla encountered the envelope during an evening review at Clarence House, one of the king's official residences in London. At the time, selected private papers were being reorganized as household archives changed hands. An archive, in simple terms, is the controlled collection where important historical and personal records are stored. Sensitive letters were being separated from ceremonial documents, and several items had been marked for Charles to read personally, rather than being preserved without his attention. The aide handling the papers hesitated when Diana's envelope appeared. He explained that the letter had been identified as correspondence meant for Charles, not merely as a historical item. Camilla asked to see it. She read enough to understand what it contained: Diana's private thoughts about William and Harry, her damaged relationship with Charles, and her fear that unresolved resentment among adults could someday influence decisions involving her sons. Camilla felt the danger immediately. She believed giving those words to Charles could reopen wounds he had spent years trying to close. She also feared William might eventually see the letter as proof that his mother's concerns had been pushed aside while the family rebuilt itself around a new order. For her, the envelope was not simply paper. It carried the power to drag the past into the present. The aide paused when Camilla told him to leave the letter with her. He understood that correspondence intended for Charles should normally continue into the king's personal reading file, meaning the private collection of material reserved specifically for his attention. But she reassured him that she would handle it personally. He finally released the envelope. Days passed, then weeks. Camilla never returned it. The letter disappeared from the expected inventory and eventually surfaced inside a secondary archival folder with no obvious connection to Diana. That placement made it almost invisible. Someone searching her correspondence would never naturally look there. William later reconstructed the sequence, after discovering the old routing notation. He requested the original archive log, the written record tracking where documents had moved, and compared the entries carefully. The conclusion hit him with brutal clarity. Camilla had not merely seen Diana's letter, she had made the decision that Charles would not. And now, years after that quiet choice, William was ready to force the truth into the open, with Charles and Camilla finally standing in the same room, and nowhere left for either of them to hide. Camilla entered expecting questions. Instead, she found the past waiting for her on the table. Charles did not accuse her immediately. William did not raise his voice. For several unbearable seconds, nobody spoke at all. Then the king pushed Diana's letter toward his wife and asked whether she had seen it before. Camilla looked down, recognized the envelope, and hesitated. That single pause told Charles more than any denial could have done. Charles asked her to sit. Camilla did, but her attention moved immediately to William. She questioned why the prince needed to remain for something so private. The king refused to send him away. This was no longer only a marital argument. The letter had been intended for Charles, but it also concerned William directly, and that made his presence impossible to dismiss. Camilla finally admitted that she had taken control of the envelope. She insisted she had acted to protect Charles during a period when he was already carrying enormous emotional pressure. In her mind, Diana's words could have reopened wounds he had struggled for years to survive. The queen consort, the wife of the reigning king, argued that she had believed silence would prevent old pain from poisoning the future. William could not accept that. He told Camilla calmly that protecting Charles did not give her ownership over Diana's words. The prince reminded her that the letter also spoke about Diana's sons, and no one had the right to decide what William was permitted to know about his own mother. He never raised his voice. That restraint made the accusation feel even harder. Charles asked one question that changed the room. "How long did you know where it was?" Camilla hesitated again. She tried to explain that years had passed and circumstances had changed, but the king heard what she was avoiding. This had not been one frightened decision followed by immediate regret. She had known the letter remained hidden, and she had allowed that silence to continue. Charles returned to Diana's final paragraph. Her words urged him never to allow future relationships to create emotional distance between him and William. The sentence now carried a brutal irony. The very warning that had been buried was unfolding between them. Camilla reached for the letter. Charles covered it with his hand. No. William looked at his father. Charles then said the document would no longer remain under the control of any one household. It would be formally secured and reviewed through protected royal custody, meaning controlled handling designed to prevent personal interference. That decision changed everything. The question was no longer only what Camilla had done. It was who would control what happened next. Royal power is rarely revealed through shouting. More often, it appears through a folder being moved, an instruction being rewritten, or a future king refusing to yield. After the confrontation, William did something far more consequential than expressing anger. He insisted that sensitive family correspondence could no longer depend on personal loyalty. Charles, still wounded by what he had learned, now faced a choice between protecting his marriage and protecting trust inside the monarchy. William spoke carefully, but his position was firm. As heir, he argued that private royal material involving direct descendants, succession matters, and deceased family members needed clear custody rules, rather than informal household decisions. Succession matters, in plain language, are issues connected to who will inherit the crown and how the monarchy passes to the next generation. For the prince, Diana's hidden letter had exposed a weakness that could not simply be ignored. Charles understood the argument, but the decision still belonged to him. The king alone had the authority to determine how access would change and whether Camilla's actions justified a formal restriction. That power made the moment harder, not easier. He was not judging a distant official. He was deciding whether the woman he loved had crossed a line serious enough to change the way his own household operated. Charles remained alone for several minutes after William finished speaking. He looked at the closed folder containing Diana's letter and felt the conflict tightening around him. Camilla had claimed she acted to protect him, but she had still made a choice in his name without permission. The king could forgive fear. What he could not ignore was the precedent that fear had created. William returned to the deeper danger. He told his father this was bigger than one document, and bigger than one painful chapter. If personal loyalty could override transparent responsibility once, it could happen again. The future king understood that the monarchy was already moving toward another generation, and any hidden system of private influence could become far more damaging later. Charles finally acted. He ordered an immediate review of restricted personal archives connected to his household. Restricted archives are records that only approved people may access because of their sensitivity. The review would examine who requested files, who removed correspondence, and which materials had been transferred without direct authorization. The first results brought another shock. Several catalog entries from the same period had been reassigned outside their expected filing route. Nothing yet proved another concealment, but the king now knew Diana's letter had not followed ordinary procedure. Charles signed a short authorization transferring the document into protected royal archival control. His hand trembled slightly as he set down the pen. William noticed. Then Camilla received the message. Her informal access to those files had been suspended. The signature lasted only seconds. Its consequences would reach her immediately. Until that day, Camilla had moved through Charles's private world with the confidence of someone who believed trust was settled. Then came a small but devastating change. A member of the household informed her that certain personal archive requests now required the king's written authorization. There was no announcement, no dramatic decree, no raised voice. Yet she understood immediately. Charles had placed a boundary where none had existed before. Camilla asked whether the restriction applied only to Diana's letter. The aide explained that the new procedure covered sensitive personal correspondence connected to the king's household. Written authorization, in simple terms, meant Charles now had to personally approve access before those records could be handled. She was not losing her royal position, but she could no longer step into that private system and expect her instructions to be accepted automatically. The change spread quietly through the household. Staff who had once balanced requests from both Charles and Camilla now received a clear direction. Disputed correspondence had to pass through the king's designated office. That mattered because uncertainty had been removed. No one could claim confusion anymore. The monarch had drawn a line, and everyone around him knew exactly where it stood. Camilla dismissed the aide and remained alone. Anger came first, then humiliation. But beneath both was something more painful. Charles no longer trusted her judgment in an area where she had believed their understanding was absolute. The queen consort had spent years building a life beside him, only to discover that one hidden envelope had created distance no public criticism had managed to create. Charles faced her later that evening. She tried to explain that everything she had done came from fear of reopening old wounds. The king stopped her before the explanation could become another defense. He told her he could not talk about forgiveness until he understood why she had allowed the truth to remain buried for so long. Then he walked away before she could finish. William received different news. Charles had authorized him to keep an authenticated copy of Diana's letter, meaning a formally verified duplicate confirmed as matching the original. For the prince, the gesture carried enormous weight. His mother's words had finally reached him without anyone else deciding what he could read. Camilla understood the deeper consequence almost immediately. The secret had done something she had never intended. It had pulled Charles and William closer together through a shared sense of betrayal. She removed her glasses, folded the notice restricting her access, and placed it beside her untouched tea. Then Charles returned. This time, he came alone, and without aides, titles, or procedure between them, Camilla would finally have to answer the question she had avoided from the beginning. Why had she truly buried Diana's letter? There was no audience when Camilla finally gave Charles the answer he had been waiting for. No William. No palace officials. No one prepared to turn emotion into procedure. Just a husband, a wife, and the memory of a woman whose presence had followed their marriage from the beginning. Charles asked once more why the letter had been hidden. This time, Camilla stopped defending the decision and admitted what had driven it: fear. Charles kept the paperwork away from the conversation. He told Camilla that he did not want another explanation about archival rules or household procedure. He wanted the personal truth. The king had already read the records. What mattered now was why the woman closest to him had believed she had the right to decide what he should never see. Camilla finally answered. She said Diana's letter frightened her because it was not filled with rage. It contained warmth toward Charles, concern for William, and words that made one truth impossible to escape. Diana would always remain part of the family's emotional life. The queen consort admitted that she feared the letter could pull Charles backward into regret and make William believe his mother had understood dangers no one else had taken seriously. Camilla's voice weakened as she continued. She said hiding the letter had become, in her mind, a way of protecting the life she and Charles had finally built. She had spent years living beside memories that could never be erased. When the envelope appeared, she believed keeping it buried would stop those memories from gaining fresh power. Charles did not shout. That made his answer harder. He told Camilla that fear might explain what she had done, but it could not excuse choosing for him. The deepest wound was not simply that she had hidden Diana's words. It was that his own wife had believed their marriage was so fragile that truth had to be controlled to protect it. Charles then admitted something of his own. His refusal to speak openly about Diana for years had helped create a culture where the past was managed instead of faced. The king accepted that failure, but he made clear that responsibility for hiding the letter still belonged to Camilla. Later, Charles found William alone. He told his son about the private conversation. He did not ask the prince to forgive anyone. He simply said, "Your mother should never have been silenced." William paused, then handed his authenticated copy of the letter to his father. "Keep it." Charles accepted it. For the first time, the document was no longer only evidence of betrayal. It had become something father and son could finally face together. But the palace could no longer contain what had happened. By morning, the buried letter would become a national story. Royal secrets rarely remain private once palace routines begin to change. By morning, questions were already spreading about a tense meeting involving Charles, William, and Camilla. Then curiosity turned into something much larger. One newspaper placed an old envelope beside Diana's photograph and declared that her words had finally reached the king. In a single moment, a private family wound became a national story. Charles understood immediately why the reaction was so intense. The story was not simply about an old letter. It was about correspondence, intended for him, that had remained hidden, while the royal family spent years presenting reconciliation and stability to the public. The royal household, the staff and offices that support the monarch and senior family members, refused to discuss the letter's contents, but confirmed that procedures involving historic personal correspondence had been reviewed. William quickly became the emotional center of the coverage. Commentators focused on the fact that the prince had not attacked Camilla publicly or demanded humiliation. Instead, he had carried Diana's letter directly to his father. That act was framed as something deeply personal, a son refusing to let his mother's voice remain controlled by somebody else. William had chosen confrontation, but he had also chosen restraint. Charles faced a harsher contradiction. Some saw the king as a man deceived inside his own household. Others questioned how such a deeply personal document could disappear for years without reaching him. The monarch now faced sympathy and scrutiny at the same time, forced to confront emotional consequences that decades of ceremony had never completely erased. Outside Windsor Castle, the story acquired a human face. A small crowd gathered near the gates, and one woman placed white flowers beside a handwritten card carrying 4 simple words. Her words mattered. The message spread across evening broadcasts, turning Diana's absence into something immediate again. The morning papers pushed the story even further. One front page showed an aged cream envelope beside Diana's photograph beneath the words, "The letter Charles never saw." The headline captured the public mood because it reduced years of silence, loyalty, grief, and suspicion into one devastating idea. The king had been denied words meant for him. Charles watched the coverage briefly. Then he turned it off. The king picked up Diana's letter instead and went to find William. Headlines could describe what had happened, but they could not decide what it would mean for father and son or for Camilla. The public had already delivered its judgment. Now Charles had to deliver the only verdict that could truly close the wound. In the end, the most important consequence of Diana's letter was not punishment. It was clarity. Charles could not recover the years in which the envelope remained hidden. William could not reclaim the conversations that might have happened if his mother's words had surfaced earlier. Camilla could not turn fear into justification. But all three could decide whether this discovery would become another secret buried inside palace walls. So the moment silence finally lost its power. Charles made that decision first. He confirmed that the letter would remain securely preserved, with a complete record of where it had been, who had handled it, and how it had disappeared. Protected royal records, meaning sensitive documents kept under controlled access, would no longer be subject to one person's private judgment. No family member, including Camilla, would be allowed to remove or suppress correspondence simply because its contents were painful. William accepted the outcome without demanding humiliation. The prince had never wanted a public punishment or a ceremonial fall from grace. He wanted Diana's words acknowledged, protected, and freed from somebody else's fear. Charles had now guaranteed that. For William, that mattered more than revenge ever could. Charles then spoke to his son with a kind of honesty that had been missing for years. He admitted that Diana's letter reminded him their shared history could not be rewritten into comfortable pieces. William answered that he had never wanted his father trapped in the past. He only wanted the king to stop allowing anyone to erase the parts of that past that were difficult to face. Camilla faced a different ending. Charles did not end their marriage, but he made clear that trust had changed. He told the queen consort that forgiveness remained possible because she had finally admitted the truth. But love alone could no longer excuse secrecy. Trust would have to be rebuilt through honesty, slowly and deliberately. The letter had failed to do what Camilla feared most. It did not destroy Charles and William. It brought them closer. Charles folded Diana's letter carefully along its original crease and placed it inside its protective envelope. He handed it to William one final time. The prince touched it, paused, then gave it back. "Keep it where it belongs." Charles nodded. There was no mystery left. Camilla had buried the letter because she feared its power. William recovered it because he refused to let fear decide history. Charles chose truth over silence. And that became the final lesson. The monarchy survived not by hiding what hurt, but by facing it. The letter meant to divide them, became the letter that finally brought a father and son closer together. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.